go. All right. And it's coming. Okay, so last time we studied Daniel chapter 10, how the prophet had an encounter with Jesus, how Daniel received a vision and prayed for 21 days without receiving an answer because Gabriel, the highest angel in heaven, was locked in a spiritual battle against the devil himself over the mind of King Cyrus. And at the end of that 21-day period, Michael, which we discovered is another name for Jesus, came to the aid of Gabriel, and the purpose of Satan was defeated. God won that battle, and Gabriel flew to Daniel and began helping him understand the meaning of the vision he had been given. And that's what Daniel 11 and chapter 12 are. So as we study this, the book of Daniel is a fascinating and widely studied book. Now, there are many different symbols that have to be unlocked in order to understand it. This vision in particular, every single vision that we've looked at in the book of Daniel is contained in this vision. All right, we've been looking at a great prophetic theme that's been running throughout the major portions of Daniel. I just want to give you a little bit of a review. Okay, so when we studied Daniel chapter 2, we discovered this dream with four metals that represented, and this is the theme: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And then the feet of iron and clay represented this union of church and state that would rise up at the end of time. And the dream in Daniel 2 says that the kingdoms of this world will be destroyed when Jesus comes again. All right. Daniel chapter 7, the prophet is given the same four powers, this time represented as four beasts, and even more details are given. You have details regarding this beast representing Greece, which we're really going to look at this afternoon in Daniel 11. And then we have a vision of how the Western Roman Empire would split up into 10 kingdoms represented by 10 horns. And 7 of these became some of the modern nations of Europe, like Spain and England and France. And 3 of the other powers were destroyed by another power that would rise that we found out was the Antichrist. And the Antichrist power would rule for 1,260 years. It would persecute God and his people. So in one of our studies, we studied where we looked at the characteristics of this power and discovered that the papacy was this power that was predicted to rise, and that before the second coming could happen, there had to be a judgment in heaven. In Daniel chapter 8, you have these same 4 powers. Babylon is just mentioned because Babylon is only a few years from passing off the scene of world history. So you have Medo-Persia, Greece, and then a horn that represents both Rome in its pagan phases and its papal phases. And then at the end of Daniel 8, we have this 2,300 day period that related to the cleansing of the sanctuary. And in Daniel chapter 9, we looked at this time period and we found out that it was 2,300 literal years. And the first 490 years of that time period related to the Jews. So in Daniel chapter 9, we found out that the same event began both the 2,300 years and the 490 years, and it was the restoration, it was this decree by the Persian king Artaxerxes to restore the Jewish nation, return the Jews to their homeland, and Judah became a province of Medo-Persia. I want you to remember that because a lot of what we discuss will affect the Jews in Daniel's time and in the future. Okay, so that's what these prophecies are about. That's one of the reasons we studied about who Israel is in Bible prophecy, because before 34 AD, it represents a literal nation. And then after that, like we found out, it became a global people, a people from every nation that would accept Christ. So events that take place in Daniel 11 that are after 34 AD are regarding this new spiritual Israel. Okay. So after 34 AD, the some of what the prophecy, um, we've looked at some of what it's covered, like about the little horn and the Antichrist. Daniel 11, and especially the book of Revelation, get into even more detail about what happened the remaining period, the remaining 1810 years. So we're going to find little details. And Zoraida had asked a question about how did the papacy come about? How did the church go from being the early church to the papal system? That's what we're going to find when we get into our studies on Revelation. So the book of Daniel chapter 11 and 12, Revelation uncovers that in even greater detail. Okay, so after in Daniel 11, we are going to encounter these two powers. We're going to encounter them in Revelation 2. They are called the King of the North and the King of the South. Now, there are all kinds of different ideas as to what these powers represented. All right. The Bible tells us that the North, these two powers are named this because of their relation to where Israel is. Okay. Notice that the King of the North is north of Israel and the King of the South is south of Israel. But after these powers pass off the scene, and after Israel becomes a global identity, now we're looking at spiritual characteristics that these literal powers had that passed on to other nations that would attack God and his people. So let's start with the King of the North. So the King of the North was the direction by which the enemies of God's people would normally attack it. This is desert here. So the armies that would attack Israel would come along here. This region was called the Fertile Crescent, and they would come down and they would attack Israel from the north. And there are some verses that tell us that the enemies of God's people would attack them from the north. In Joel chapter 2, the Bible describes this for us.
Blow the trumpet in Zion. A day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like the morning clouds spread over the mountains. A people come, great and strong, the like of whom has never been, nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. A fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Surely nothing shall escape them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like swift steeds, so they run.
And then in verse 18, it actually describes where this army comes from.
Then the Lord will be zealous for his land and pity his people. The Lord will answer and say to his people, behold, I will send you grain and new wine and oil, and you will be satisfied by them. I will no longer make you a reproach among the nations, but I will remove far from you the northern army and will drive him away into a barren and desolate land with his face toward the eastern sea and his back toward the western sea. His stench will come up and his foul odor will rise because he has done monstrous things.
Okay, so this army, and we're going to talk about this at a later time because this verse actually parallels things in Daniel 11 that we'll be covering at another time. This army comes from the north, It comes to oppress God's people and attack it, just like what would happen to God's people throughout time. Now, God himself is represented as ruling from the north. The direction of God's rule comes from the north, the spiritual direction north. In Psalm 48, the Bible tells us that.
Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in his holy mountain, beautiful in elevation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. God is in her palaces. He is known as her refuge.
So the true king of the north would be God. But these powers attempt to take God's place because there was one in the very beginning, the devil, who tried. It's his goal to rule in place of God. And that's what the Bible tells us in Isaiah 14. Lucifer, as Satan was known before he fell, that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to take God's place.
How are you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation, on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High.
Notice the devil wanted to sit on the sides of the north where God sits. He wanted to rule, and he's inspired these powers throughout time. That's their same desire, and they oppress God's people. And Daniel chapter 11, we're going to find, mainly concerns the king of the north and his war against God's people. So these characteristics are passed down from power to power. And I'll show you that today when another power assumes that mantle, that title, King of the North. And in some of our future studies in Daniel 11. But the king of the north is the main oppressor of God's people. Now, the king of the south is another satanic power on earth that makes war not only against God's people, but against the king of the north. Now, he's more earthly minded. The king of the south is more earthly minded. In other words, while the king of the north will have a religious face, the king of the south is openly antagonistic against God and God's people. All right. You won't see this religious face that this power puts on. And but in spite of this animosity, it has been used by God. But I want to show you a characteristic of this power. At times, it does not even acknowledge that God exists. And this is going back to what Pharaoh said to Moses.
And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go.
Okay, so the devil can work through the king of the north, professed religious powers that believe they're working for God, when in reality they work for the devil, and open in other powers that are not religious in nature, but work against God and his people as well. But God has used the king of the south at times to check the king, to hold the king of the north in check. I mean, there have been times that whatever power held the mantle of king of the north could have wiped out God's people and stopped God's purposes. But God impressed the king of the south to attack the king of the north. Even though it's a satanic power, there are political powers that God can work through to establish his purposes and to protect his people. All right. So to state it plainly, just so you know, the king of the north and the king of the south are literal powers at the start of this prophecy. But their spiritual characteristics are passed down to other powers that control their territory that they originally had. And they take up the conflict that the original powers did against each other and against God and his people. Okay, and I'll be pointing that out. Now, Daniel chapter 11 is a fascinating chapter. All right, it begins in the time of Daniel and it continues all the way to the second coming of Christ, because chapter 12 is part of that as well. Along the way, we will see many great events that have taken place in history. Remember, like I've already mentioned, these events are fulfilled prophecy for us in 2021. But in Daniel's day, 2,600 years ago, they were still future events. The prophecies are very detailed and they're exact in their fulfillment. Daniel chapter 11 is different from the other prophetic chapters that we've studied for this reason. The other chapters deal with prophetic symbols, and Daniel chapter 11 has a few, but basically it's literal language. There's not a whole lot of prophetic symbol in Daniel chapter 11. So, as with all prophecy, there's confusion on some of the interpretation of the events in the chapter. Some people put them way in the past, some people put them in the future. What we are going to look at, we're going to look at what's called the historicist interpretation of Bible prophecy. And what this does is it looks at events for a historical fulfillment. In other words, you look at them in history. And if you cannot find a fulfillment in history, they must be future, okay? And we look at them the way Daniel understood in his time, all right? So this chapter is so massive that we're only going to cover the first 14 verses today. So let's step through this curtain that God is pulling back for us. Let's step through the curtain and let's start looking at the chapter itself. So Daniel chapter 11, verse 1 and 2.
Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all by his strength. Through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece.
Okay, so notice this prophecy. The first thing that we find is that Babylon has fallen already. Babylon is passed off the scene. Remember when we studied last week that we found that the date the prophecy was given was 535 BC. All right, so 4 years earlier, the attack on Babylon had come. The Babylonian Empire has passed off the scene. Darius the Mede, which was a provincial governor in Babylon, he took over. Daniel and the lion's den happened that we've already studied. And then Darius the Mede died. And Cyrus assumed direct control over all of the empire, including Babylon. Cyrus was already ruling, but without that provincial governor, Cyrus is now the king of Babylon, okay, from Daniel's perspective. So Gabriel is saying that Darius the Mede prospered in his short rule because he listened to the advice of heaven. Now, this is a principle we need to understand today, because when nations will heed the advice that God gives them, they'll prosper. When they reject God's advice, national ruin will happen. And that's what will ultimately happen to all these nations that we see in this prophecy. So Cyrus was ruling. Gabriel is standing by Cyrus to aid him, just like he did Darius the Mede. Okay, Cyrus ruled the Medo-Persian Empire from 550 BC, when Persia conquered the Median Empire, through 539 BC, when Medo-Persia assumed control over Babylon. And remember, this prophecy is about what happens to Daniel's people, Israel. So that is the date. That's why we assign 539 BC, because that's the date the Persian Empire assumed control over the Jews. And Cyrus ruled another 9 years after 539. It would be 4 years after the date of this prophecy was given. So in 530 BC, Cyrus sees a land up here in Central Asia, right about here. And he decides that he's going to take control of that land. So what he decides to do is he's going to woo the queen of that land and propose marriage. After all, who would turn down the greatest emperor on earth? Well, that's exactly what she does. So Cyrus decides to conquer her territory by force, and he died in this war in Central Asia. Okay, now the prophecy tells us that there would be 4 more kings after Cyrus. Okay, notice how bloodthirsty Cyrus was. If you didn't go with the program, he would conquer you. And that is the attitude both the king of the north and the king of the south have. So I want to point that out. So the next son is, and you can read this in the history books. Don't worry about memorizing the dates. I just want to show you how the prophecy was fulfilled. Cambyses II was the son of Cyrus, and he had a very short reign, but one of the things he did was conquer Egypt. All right. And he took his brother with him. His brother's name was Bardia. All right. Now, Cambyses conquers Egypt in 525 BC. He conquers what's now Libya. He had sent his brother back home. We're going to talk about this brother in a second. And he receives word that this brother has raised up and is now ruling the Persian Empire. So he can't have that. So he goes on to go back to Persia to have this brother executed. Now, there's something he knew about this brother that other people didn't, most other people, and we'll touch on that in a minute. On the way, he falls off his chariot, gets a leg wound, which gets gangrene, and Cambyses died on the way. So remember, the prophecy said there's 4 rulers after Cyrus. So this is number 1. Number 2 was Cambyses' half brother. Sorry about the picture. That's the best I could find on him. He ruled a couple months. His name was Bardia. Now, Bardia is interesting because there are 2 people in history that were named Bardia from this time. And historians for a long time were not sure which one of them ruled Medo-Persia. Now, what I want to point out to you is that a lot of the wars we're going to find in this chapter are the result of family feuds and family jealousy. Bardia was the half brother of Cambyses. Same father, different mother. And he was with him in Egypt. Cyrus sent him back to Persia, not Cyrus, Cambyses, sorry. Cambyses sent him back to Persia because Bardia was a better archer. Cambyses was jealous. But then shortly after Bardia reaches Persia, Cambyses has a dream that he sees Bardia ruling Persia. So he sends this official, high-ranking Medo-Persian official to Persia, and the man assassinated Bardia. And only a few people, including Cambyses, knew. Well, then he receives word that Bardia is ruling, and he knows this man is an imposter who took the name Bardia. So when he goes to take him off the throne, that's when Cambyses died. But this imposter met his end shortly after by the 3rd king mentioned in the prophecy. This king was known as Darius the Great. This is not the same Darius, Darius the Mede. This is a different Darius. Him and 6 other people formed a conspiracy. They assassinated Bardia. Okay. Now, Darius the Mede restored the glory of the Medo-Persian Empire because it had kind of gone downhill since Cyrus. And he had many successes. But one of his most well-known defeats was an attack on Greece in 490 BC. And that is where marathon came from. If you guys have heard of people running a marathon, there was a battle at a place called Marathon Basically, the Persians were coming. There was a man who ran 27 miles, gave the Greek army the message, the Persians are coming. They get ready. The man dropped dead after giving the message. And that's where the marathon is. So hopefully, if you ever run a marathon, the same thing that happened to that guy won't happen to you. Okay. But the marathon was a defeat for the Persians. Darius withdrew. He strengthened his forces, intending to come back, but he died. He died of pneumonia in 486 BC. Now, ruler number 4 is a man by the name of Xerxes. And Xerxes is well known. He's mentioned in movies and in history books. And Xerxes ruled Medo-Persia at the height of its power. Okay, and that's why he's described as this king who's going to be the richest of all. All the wealth flowed into his treasury. But from all the far reaches, this is the height of the Medo-Persian Empire. After Xerxes, it goes downhill. Okay. Xerxes decides, I'm gonna conquer Greece after all. So he amasses an army that the historians of the day say 5 million people. Not only that, he enlists the aid of a power in the West known as Carthage. So he fulfills this prophecy that he will raise up all against the realm of Greece. And unfortunately for Xerxes, that there is a defeat. There's this battle here, Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held the pass at the same time the Greeks were getting ready here. And there's a huge naval battle. The forces of Carthage are defeated, and the final battle takes place the following year in Plataea, and that's the end. Persia never again successfully invades Greece. Now, this is where Greece comes on the scene, okay? And these are all the rulers of Persia. After Xerxes, there were 7 more rulers, okay? And it skips over all of them. I just want you to notice this one, Artaxerxes I. It was his rule that the 2300 years began, okay? But the prophecy skips over all of them until the beginning of Greece. So when they attack Greece, that's when Greece rises into the prophecy. We're going to see this pattern repeated with Rome. When Rome is attacked, Rome enters the prophecy. So Greece is now going to be the new king in the prophecy, the new oppressor of God's people. And that's what Mom's about to read to you. Daniel chapter 11, verses 3 and 4.
Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these.
Okay, so this mighty king is Alexander the Great. And Alexander was a military genius. He was powerful in battle, and he was very successful. He conquered all of this territory in 12 years. 12 years, faster than anyone had ever conquered the world before. All right. He not only conquered the Medo-Persian Empire, but some of the territory here in the east beyond Medo-Persia. Okay. But Alexander had some problems. He couldn't conquer his own passions. And after a wild night of partying, in which it's estimated that he drank more than 12 gallons of alcohol, he became sick. I mean, he poisoned himself with that much alcohol, and he died a few days later. Okay, just like the prophecy states, and we've studied this in Daniel chapter 8, where Alexander's described as the first horn of the goat. When it was strong, he was broken. When Alexander was at the height of his power, he fell. Alexander was a good general, but not a good politician. He didn't leave a successor. So a fighting broke out. All right, fighting broke out among the generals and the politicians in Alexander's empire. And eventually, four divisions remain. Remember, it would be divided, one toward each toward the four winds of heaven. Four pieces, four horns in Daniel 8, four heads on the leopard in Daniel 7, and four divisions toward the winds of heaven. Okay, and history proves it. You can read it in the history books. All this fighting, a lot of people die. Among them, all of Alexander's wives, his young son, and his mother. So the empire is not left to any of Alexander's children. They all died in the fighting. His whole family was destroyed. So these four kingdoms would dominate the culture of the Mediterranean world for the next 2.5 centuries. So from the time of Alexander until the rise of Rome, you have 2.5 centuries with these divisions of the Greek Empire. These four generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander. The only two I want you to focus on are these two, because these other two soon pass off the scene in prophecy. So these two are the important ones, okay? And now is where we come to where the king of the north and the king of the south enter the prophecy in Daniel 11:5.
Also, the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion.
Okay, so there are two different people mentioned. First, you have the king of the south, and that's Ptolemy. Ptolemy conquered Egypt and all of this territory that you see here in blue. After conquering that, and Ptolemy was the first of the four to gain control of that division. The others fought amongst each other for a while, and while they were doing that, Ptolemy became strong. Okay, so Ptolemy built fortifications, he conquered other territories, and he made his kingdom strong. Now, the other prince of Alexander that the prophecy mentions is was a man by the name of Seleucus. Seleucus conquered all of this territory here. But eventually, he conquers the kingdoms of Lysimachus and Cassander. So instead of there being four divisions, now there are two. And notice their relation to Israel. You have Ptolemy in the south, you have Seleucus in the north. So Seleucus and his family found what's called the Seleucid dynasty, which rules over all this northern territory. And Ptolemy founds the Ptolemaic dynasty, his family. And these continued for centuries. And on the screen, don't worry about the dates. I just want to show you this. These continued when they pass off the scene, like the last Seleucid king in 63 BC, Rome conquered them. And then the last one over here was Cleopatra and her son or her brother, and Rome conquered them. So they rule all this territory. So the next few verses that we're going to read about, and we're going to spend the rest of our study on today, are really family feuds between two Greek families that ruled the entire Mediterranean world in the East until the time of Rome. Okay, so while they've long since passed off the scene, the Mediterranean culture became a really big part of the world. And I just want to show you how. Let me go to the next slide, and I want to talk about this for a minute. Okay, the Greeks had an idea that things had to be logical, practical, make sense. You had to investigate ideas. That's a Greek idea. Okay, that was passed on to Rome. And then because everybody that I know of in this study, when the Roman Empire broke up, whether you are a descendant of someone from Spain or Portugal or England or Germany, that passed on. And as a result, that idea passed on to the colonies they would found in the West, like the United States and the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. So this idea from the Greek world of things being logical and practical and making sense, which is how we've looked at Bible prophecy throughout our studies, that comes from the Greek idea. And it was present in the time of Christ, okay? The Greeks changed the world with that idea. So you can see some 2,000, almost 3,000 years later, that ideal still penetrates and is part of society, including modern science. So we can thank the Greeks for that. Also, I just want to mention this time period that we're discussing is not mentioned in the Bible. Okay, the Bible, the Old Testament ends when Medo-Persia is ruling, and it begins when Rome rules. So this entire period, the only place it's mentioned is in the book of Daniel. So now we're going to look at Daniel chapter 11 and verse 6.
And at the end of some years, they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times.
Okay, so this is the beginning of a family feud. Okay, so what happened was these two kingdoms, the Ptolemy kingdom, the king of the south, and the Seleucid kingdom, the king of the north, fought a lot of wars. So in the year 253 BC, Ptolemy II, the king of the south, decided, let's try to make a political alliance with the king of the north. I have this good-looking daughter named Berenice. Let me send her up there. If he marries her, then he'll be my son-in-law, and the heir of that, any offspring they have, can rule over both kingdoms and reunite the Greek Empire. Two big problems in that. Number one, God said the Greek Empire would never be reunited. Prophecy predicted that. Number two, Antiochus already had a wife and children. He had a wife named Laodice, and he agreed. He sent her away from court, divorced her, and Berenice wasn't exactly a nice person either. She convinces Antiochus to disown his own children. So the arrangement works out for a little while. The two of them have a child, but Laodice, the disgraced wife, is enraged and plots with anger. Zacchaeus grows dissatisfied with Berenice. So he brings Laodice and his other children back. He brings his former wife and his children back, restores her to a position of power. Well, she decides, I'm not going to have risk being put away again. So she has Antiochus poisoned to death. Well, then she doesn't want anybody standing in the way of her and her son ruling the kingdom of the north. So she has Berenice, all the bodyguards, all the attendants from Egypt assassinated, just like the prophecy said, including the son, the young son. We can't have him sit on the throne because it's going to be my son. All right. Now, this is going to spark a feud that will cost thousands of people their lives and be continuing decades later. Okay. Now, the next few verses describe what happens, the next step in this feud. Daniel 11, 7 through 9.
But from a branch of her roots, one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And he shall also carry their gods captive into Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Also, the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land.
Okay, so what this is describing is so Laodice had Berenice assassinated in 246 BC. Her father Ptolemy died shortly after that. Many sources say it was due to grief. He loved his daughter a lot. Uh, but his successor, Ptolemy III, her brother, was furious. Okay. And he decided, he was encouraging, come on, Dad, let's put an end to this. Well, Dad was on his deathbed, so nothing happened. When he became king, he said, I am going to avenge my sister. So he raised a big army, marches into Syria, where the seat of the king of the north is. And in a series of battles, by this time, Laodice and her son, Seleucus II, are jointly ruling the kingdom of the north. All right. So Seleucus goes out to defend his kingdom. Ptolemy defeats him in a series of battles, captures Laodice, and executes her because, she had my sister killed. Can you see how revenge can lead to more killing? Well, not only did Ptolemy capture a lot of territory, among which, and the reason why these prophecies are important is one of the main provinces that exchanged hands the most during this was a province known as Judea, which was the homeland of the Jews. So the Jews had been under Seleucus, then Ptolemy takes possession of it, and it would happen. It would exchange. Remember, this prophecy is regarding the Jews, so that's why this is important. So Ptolemy plunders the northern kingdom by taking 40,000 talents of silver. Now, that doesn't mean a lot, but based on the price of silver today, 40,000 talents of silver is approximately $56 billion. Okay. So that's a lot of spoil. He takes a lot of precious gems and stones, and he also really makes the Egyptian people happy by taking 2,500 idols back to Egypt that Cambyses had taken away in his conquest. So he's a hero. But that's not enough for Ptolemy. He got the mom, he wants the son too. So he keeps conquering that northern kingdom as far east as Babylon. He just about has Seleucus captured, and he's about ready. He has one last battle he's going to capture him, but he receives word that there's a revolt back home. So he lets Seleucus live and he goes home. Now, Seleucus goes back to his kingdom. He raises an army because he's going to conquer Ptolemy when Ptolemy's busy with the rebellion. Well, Ptolemy puts an end to the rebellion, defeats Seleucus's army. Seleucus limps on home. All right. Now, the prophecy also states that Ptolemy, the king of the south, would live longer than Seleucus. Seleucus died 4 years before Ptolemy did. So the prophecies fulfilled. Okay. And I just thought I would mention, remember the prophecy was given to Daniel in 535 BC? Seleucus died in 225 BC. Ptolemy died 4 years later in 221. So guys, we're talking about events that God predicted with accuracy over 300 years before they happened. All right. Now I want to talk for a moment before we go on, because there's more in this this feud between two families, but there's something God tells us about exacting revenge on people, and it's found in Hebrews 10:30.
For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And again, the Lord will judge his people.
Okay, so life is not about taking revenge. It's about forgiving, even when it hurts your inner core. Revenge only places anger and hatred inside. Okay, the reason God tells us to leave vengeance, that's from God, that's justice up to him, is because human beings will take revenge in shedding blood. Okay. Um, and killing will only lead to more killing, just like what we're going to see. Berenice was killed, Laodice was killed. Now there's even more about to happen. But killing will only need to lead to killing, and peace can never come as a result of that. Personal revenge is not a reason to fight a war. Neither are wars of conquest. Wars should only be waged to stop dictators who commit acts of aggression, such as Adolf Hitler, Saddam Hussein. Those are examples. Or to stop terrorists who plot to kill millions of people, thousands of people, who plot to kill innocent people. That's the reason why when war is justified. Otherwise, it just is senseless bloodshed. Okay. Daniel 11:10 describes the kings of the south, the sons of Seleucus II, desiring to take revenge again.
However, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife.
Okay, so what happened was, remember, Ptolemy defeats Seleucus because of what happened to his sister, and the revenge attack didn't work. So Seleucus II dies in 225 BC, and his two sons, Antiochus III and Seleucus III, said, "We're going to get revenge on Egypt for what they did to our dad." So once again, even more revenge. So the first brother, Seleucus III, comes to the throne, and he builds this big army, and he's getting ready to march south, but he treats the army badly. And in 222 BC, the generals of the army assassinate him. Okay, so that leaves Antiochus III, called in history Antiochus the Great, the king of the north, and he marches south. Now, by this time, Ptolemy III is close to death himself. So Antiochus is marching, and Ptolemy doesn't have any desire to fight a war. So he sends out peace. He lets them have the province of Judah and one other province in that area for peace, and pays them off. So it's a peace treaty. The problem is both sides, instead of preparing for peace, arm for war. All right. So Ptolemy III dies, and Antiochus comes down for another battle. Okay, well, the king of the south, the new king of the south, sends this famous Egyptian general known as Nicholas to stop the progress. And Antiochus keeps coming, and he whips Nicholas in a series of battles. Well, the Bible describes for us what happens next. Daniel chapter 11, verse 11.
And the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy.
Okay, so the new king of the south, the new king of Egypt, Ptolemy IV, he's not a warrior. He's trained in battle like the kings were, but he loves to sit at home and engage in partying and other things, and that's all he wants to do. All right. But Antiochus gets closer and closer, and now Egypt is being threatened. And Ptolemy, just like the prophecy said, he becomes very angry at the thought of, man, if he conquers this, my party's over. So he marshals this large army, and Antiochus, and sends a threat, and Antiochus stops for a moment, but then he continues south. the historians say he sent a very demeaning letter back that enraged Ptolemy the more. And the two sides, Ptolemy marching north, Antiochus marching south, the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. So they collide. And the battle is called the Battle of Raphia. It happened on June 22, 217 BC, in what's now the Gaza Strip in Palestine. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see what happened in the battle. This battle is very famous. Notice how many people were involved in a dispute between two families. Antiochus, king of the north, 62,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 102 Asian elephants. Ptolemy's force, 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 73 African elephants. African elephant is the one with the big ears. Asian elephant is the bigger one with the small ears. Okay, so what happens is this is the only known battle that we know of that Asian and African elephants fought against each other in a battle. Okay, that's what makes this battle so famous. Also, the prophecy predicted that Antiochus would lose, and Antiochus loses badly. So the final tally of dead for both sides, first for Ptolemy, 2,200 men and 5 elephants. Now notice how badly Antiochus got beat. He lost 14,300 men and 42 elephants. He lost a lot of men and elephants, okay? So Ptolemy loses less, Antiochus loses 7 times more men than Ptolemy. And so Ptolemy recaptures modern day Israel, and Antiochus limps on home. This is where Daniel 11:12 picks up. And this is an insight into what kind of a person Ptolemy IV was.
When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail.
Okay, so what happened was Antiochus was beaten badly enough that if Ptolemy had followed up his victory, he could have conquered all of the kingdom of the king of the north. But instead he decides, well, the force, it's done. Let me just go back home because I want to party again. Okay, so on the way home, he's passing through Jerusalem. And he stops and he's offering this great victory to his gods. And at the height of that celebration, he decides he wants to go into the most holy place of the Jewish temple. Well, there were 2 reasons why he was not allowed in there. Number 1, he was not a descendant of Aaron. And number 2, the guy didn't have any clothes on and he was drunk as could be. So the Jews restrain him. And he doesn't forget it. He gets so angry that on his way home, he knows that there's a lot of Jews living in his kingdom of Alexandria, that he orders them massacred, and 60,000 Jews died. Well, the people get angry and they rebel. Well, Ptolemy isn't going to stand for that, and he violently put that rebellion down. And then he continued his vile indulgences, and the guy didn't live very long. He died a very early death. Daniel 11:13 tells us what Antiochus did after the battle.
For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment.
Okay, so after the Battle of Raphia, there was peace for another 14 years. While Ptolemy continues to party in Egypt, Antiochus is suppressing rebellion in his eastern provinces. Remember, his kingdom reaches as far west as Greece and all the way to almost to India. So he has a lot of rebellion. He overcomes this rebellion. He builds his army for another encounter with the king of the south. In 204 BC, Ptolemy the Fourth died. So his young 5-year-old son, Ptolemy the Fifth, becomes king of the kingdom of the south. He's the new king of the south. Antiochus decides, this is too good an opportunity. Let me bump him off and I can gain Egypt. But so he decides to raise an even greater army, and he starts conquering Ptolemy's provinces. And then Daniel 11:14 talks about what happened. And this is going to be our last verse in Daniel we'll look at today.
Now in those times, many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people will exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fail.
Okay, I'm going to reread that in the Old King James. It words it just a little differently. So Daniel 11:14 calls those violent men. That makes it sound like there were Jews. They were Jews. They're not Jews. They're people who oppressed the Jews. So it says in 11:14, in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of your people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Okay, the more correct pronunciation, instead of robbers, the original language says the breakers are the destroyers of your people. So before setting out on his campaign to conquer Egypt proper, Antiochus makes an alliance with this man, Philip V of Macedon, because Philip he rules a kingdom that borders Antiochus to the northwest, a little northwest of Greece. He can't have Philip conquering him, but Philip, also has a lot of ships that can aid in battle because the Egyptian fleet was strong. So he decides, let's make Philip an offer. And if you want to compare this is exactly what Hitler and Stalin did in World War II to conquer Poland. They say, you can have this, I'll take this, together we can conquer this power. Now, at the same time, because Ptolemy V in Egypt is so young, that there's a man, he had to have someone rule, a government official on his behalf. And this man's name was Agathocles. Agathocles ruled in the name of the king because the king was 5. Agathocles was so harsh in his treatment of all of Ptolemy's subjects that all of the provinces of the empire outside of Egypt itself rebelled. So think about it. You've got these two kings marching their armies and fleet toward you, plus all of your provinces rebel except for Egypt. But it gets better. Worse, actually. Better for Antiochus and Philip, worse for Ptolemy. So in Egypt itself, there's a rebellion, with the outcome being that the rebellious forces captured Agathocles and his family and executed them. Now, they didn't execute Ptolemy, but now the home provinces is an open revolt. 2 foreign kings are marching on your kingdom. And it seemed as if all is hopeless. This is 200 BC. And that's when the breakers of the Jews come in, the ones who would destroy the Jews. And this, the only clue for this identity of this people is found in Daniel chapter 2, in Daniel 2:40.
And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others.
So when we studied Daniel 2, we discovered that this iron kingdom was Rome. So this is the place when Rome exerts its power. This new power introduced, the Roman Republic that would become the Roman Empire, it comes into the prophecy here, just like Greece came in earlier. Okay, and from this point on, the king of the north will be Rome. the Roman Republic, and then the Roman Empire. So the Bible predicted in 535 BC that over 300 years later, in 200 BC, the Roman government would stand up and give aid to young Ptolemy. Now remember, in 535 BC, Rome was not yet a great city. And most likely Daniel had never heard of Rome. Okay. So what happens in 200 BC is that Rome senses that if Antiochus and Philip are successful and that they conquer Egypt, that Rome's position in the Mediterranean would be threatened. See, Rome at that time was in a war with Carthage. And Rome needed Egypt to be a potential ally and not to fight against it. And Rome traded a lot with Egypt. Rome had never exerted its political influence as a threat against a power that it was not directly involved with war with, okay? This was the very first time. So Rome saw this chance to break the power of these powerful kingdoms and establish itself as the dominant force in the region. And the prophecy states that it would fail. So it's predicting two things. First, it's predicting the ultimate failure of Antiochus and Philip, okay? But it's also, and their kingdoms, but it's also predicting the breakup of the Roman Empire. It's predicting that Rome would ultimately fail down the road, 476 AD. So the Bible predicted almost 1100 years before it happened, the breakup of the Roman Empire, right here in Daniel. Now, the question is, how did the Roman government aid Ptolemy? How did they stop Antiochus and Philip? That's going to be the beginning of our next study next time, okay? So one thing I want to mention is that in this life, just like Ptolemy, just like the other kings, we're going to find ourselves in situations where only divine aid can help us. All right. What I'm showing you is a picture that hung on my bedroom wall, something that looked just like this, hung on my bedroom wall as a child, because my parents told me that the angels of God will protect you and you can ask God for help. In fact, the Bible tells us that the angels of God actually go camping. And that's Psalm 34, verse 7.
The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them.
Okay, so if we ever find ourselves in a situation where, it's dangerous and there's nothing we can do to get out of it, we can call on God and God can send his angels to aid us and deliver us. That's a promise we can take from God. And that's what I want to end this study with, is just remember that God isn't an absentee landlord. He's not just hanging out in heaven, letting us take care of things on our own. He's very active and involved, not only in the march of nations and wars, but God also, if he can predict events over 300 years, 50 years, 1100 years before they happen, he knows what's going to happen in your life too. And you can trust God with the future, just like you can with the present. So let's pray, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Lord, we know we've covered a lot of history today. History that at the time the prophecy was given, it was exactly that. It was prophecy. It was future, Lord. The history books prove that your word can be trusted. These events have happened. But Lord, soon my friends and I were going to look at events in Daniel 11 that are yet future. And also in the book of Revelation, help us to know and understand that these future events will play out just as you say they did, just like the events that have already become history played out. Lord, I just pray that we will recognize that even when people wrong us, it's best to forgive instead of taking revenge, because Lord, you will take care of everything. In your court, it's justice, Lord. If we act, it's revenge. And the shedding of blood can never bring back a loved one. It can never heal a hurt heart. It only brings more pain. And Father, I also ask that when we find ourselves in positions where we're in danger, that we will call out, because you will send your angels to keep us safe, is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.